According to me, we finished the male reproductive system, yes?
Yes.
We should have taken the male on the side and cut him in two and not be very nice to him, but that's okay. He can get over it. And talked about the difference between sperm and semen, and probably also talked about vasectomies and the 600 million sperm that are present in a semen sample. So we're going to take 6G and H. So that's 6F is the male here. So we're going to take 6G and H, and we're going to combine these two questions, okay? Because to separate them, to me, doesn't make any sense. They're talking about the same thing. So we're going to combine 6G and 6H just like that. So 6G says the TDF gene, the testes determining factor on the Y chromosome. The testes determining factor on the Y chromosome causes embryonic gonads to develop as testes and secrete testosterone. Testosterone causes prenatal development of male genitalia, sperm production, and development of male secondary sex characteristics during puberty. Okay, so what did all of that mumbo jumbo mean? They talked about gonadal tissue. Like such, okay? Now, gonadal tissue is the tissue that testes and ovaries are made of. That's why we refer to testes and ovaries as gonads, okay? So what happens is when each of us was about a centimeter to 2 centimeters, and we're about this long, growing inside of our biological mother, there is prenatal tissue. Now, what does natal mean? Have any idea what natal means? Because they always talk about birth. Yes, natal is birth, natality. Natality is birth rate. So natal means birth. So that's why when you sell vitamins for women to take while they're pregnant, they're called prenatal vitamins. When you provide care to a woman who is pregnant, she hasn't given birth yet, therefore it is prenatal care, okay? So when we talk about prenatal, that's before birth. So if you have prenatal tissue, this is tissue that is being formed and developing before the offspring is born, okay? It's very simple. You have this primary tissue, and when this primary tissue is exposed to hormones, this tissue differentiates into different types of glands, okay? If this prenatal tissue is exposed to estrogen, then this prenatal tissue differentiates into an ovary. If this prenatal tissue is exposed to testosterone, that same tissue will instead differentiate into a testes. Okay, so ovaries and testes, I should have mentioned this last week. Ovaries and testes start as the same prenatal tissue. I should have talked about the labia and the scrotum start as the same tissue. Clitoris and the penis, same tissue. Ovary and testes, same tissue. Uterus and prostate, same tissue, okay? That's why it's not possible in our species to have a sexually viable, a fertile hermaphrodite, okay? In our species, you don't get ovaries and testes. You can't have clitoris and penis. You can't have labia and scrotum. Why? Because it all starts as the same tissue. You get one or the other, okay? So this whole concept of, oh, they're a hermaphrodite doesn't exist in our species. Now, if you do get an offspring where the genes don't properly express the hormones in the right concentrations, and so during development, there are different waves of testosterone and estrogen, you will get an offspring that is sterile, okay? And they will then develop rudimentary or basic reproductive systems. And at that point, the biological parent or parents make a decision whether the plastic surgeons are going to develop that tissue to appear male or appear female. Either way, the individual will, and they won't be able to reproduce. And then they will supplement that individual with hormones to create what we call secondary sex characteristics. So a secondary sex characteristic in males would be the hyoid bone, or the Adam's apple is larger. The vocal cords are more flexible, and so the voice is lower. The testosterone levels are higher, so the facial hair is thicker and body fat concentration is lower. Okay, those are all secondary sex characteristics. Those are characteristics that have nothing to do with my fertility as a male, but express biologically what a male looks like. Okay, whereas female secondary sex characteristics would be a smaller hyoid bone, higher fat retention, less flexible vocal cords, so the voice is higher, less dense body hair, less dense facial hair, the development of fat deposits on the chest around the mammary glands. Whether the individual actually has mammary glands or not, you can have the fat deposits form on the pectorals and simulate what appears to be a breast, even if there isn't a mammary gland there to actually lactate. These are all called secondary sex characteristics. All right, so gonadal tissue starts as the same tissue, and then based on the hormones, either develops into an ovary or a testes. So on the Y chromosome, there is a gene. See, usually all this time in genetics talking about sex-linked traits, and it's all XXXXXXX, right? And here we're going to have the pendulum swing the other way. We're going to talk about that Y chromosome because there are some interesting genes on the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome contains the TDF gene, okay? And what this stands for is the testes determining factor. Testes determining factor, okay? Because we all know that if this is a gene, right, it is then expressed, transcription, translation. That gene is read, produces messenger RNA. That messenger RNA is then read and translated into a protein. So the testes determining factor is a protein, okay? This protein, right, is a factor that determines the development of the testes, all right? This is the gene that causes the development of testicles and makes him a fertile male. Okay, so an individual who carries this gene and expresses it will then develop into a male. Okay, and the primary hormone that is then produced by the testes is, of course, testosterone. Now, females still produce testosterone, just in very low levels. Just like as a male, I still produce estrogen, just in very, very low levels, very low levels. Okay. So testosterone is the hormone that causes gonads to develop into testes, okay? Because again, don't forget, it's that same primary tissue, okay? And this is what we would consider a primary sex characteristic. The development and expression of ovaries or testicles is definitely a primary sex characteristic because it determines your fertility, okay? Whereas things like muscle density or let's say fat deposits, a deeper tone to the voice, the flexibility of the vocal cords, body hair density was another thing that I mentioned. Body hair density.
Mr. Monroe.
Yes.
Didn't you say, or I remember you saying something about having like a silent TDF gene?
Yep.
Can you explain it again?
Sure.
Thank you.
and totally scare all the females.
Yes, you did.
Sorry. Yeah, I will totally do that. Let me talk about estrogen and then remind me if I don't go right back. That's called the silent Y. I'll be more than happy to talk about that. Testosterone also establishes what's called libido. And libido is the fancy word for sex drive. So these hormones usually start to escalate in 11, 12, 13-year-old males. It really depends on the male, but ballpark, early teens, 11, 12, 13. Sometimes the males handle the boost in hormones well. Sometimes they don't. It's the development of sexuality is fascinating, because when females become sexually not active, that's the wrong term. When females become fertile, there's the term. When they have the ability to produce offspring, they start to menstruate. And so the sexuality of females is very much right in front of them. Okay, there is no doubt. She's like, oh wow, I'm now fertile. Okay, and so this is why socially and culturally, females tend to mature sooner. You will hear tons of people say, females mature faster. As a biologist, I'm like, because their fertility is very public and very obvious. Whereas a male, it's not like a male walks down the street and all of a sudden, oh wow, I'm producing sperm now, so I'm fertile. Okay, the male very often experiences what's called a latent sexuality, a latent maturity, because there's no one event that clearly defines a prepubescent male to a pubescent male. There is no one event that lets him know you're now fertile, and so males develop in a very in a highly variable time frame. And it's part of being male. That's fine. There's advantages and disadvantages to each. The fact that we're healthy is what matters most. All right. So from testosterone is estrogen. Of course, each of these systems always has the opposite, always has the antagonist. And so estrogen is the opposite of testosterone. This causes the gonads to develop into ovaries. And of course, ovaries are a primary sex characteristic because they determine your fertility, right? Whereas if you take all of the characteristics we just had for the male, right? Whether you're talking about the muscle density, I want to be sure and put them in the same order too to help you guys with your notes. So muscle density, fat deposits, a higher tone, a higher frequency, I should say, to the voice, and lower hair density. These have nothing to do with your fertility. These are indications of your hormone levels, and thus we refer to them as secondary sex characteristics, like such. All right, so if the individual receives an X chromosome from one biological parent and receives a Y from the other biological parent, they are genetically male. Okay. Now, this is where Robert Manwer, the biologist, struggles with how our culture outside of my classroom confuses the terms sex and gender. Okay. Because how our culture talks about sex and gender and how sex and gender are defined in biology are different. Okay. And so I really have to be aware how much my training affects how I interpret information. So when someone else says, what's your gender? What they're really asking me is male or female. And so gender biologically is not it's not a biological classification. Okay. Gender is established by culture. Gender is what is expected of an individual that is XX, or what is expected of an individual that is XY, what the culture expects of what it means to be female and what it means to be male. That is, so gender is a cultural definition. That's how a scientist sees it. Whereas a scientist also sees XX as male and XY as female. And so then I have to put that training away when someone walks up and says, what's your gender? And I say, okay, that means that they're really asking me my sex. And so I don't say, well, actually, what you mean is my sex. It's like, oh, shut your mouth. Answer their question. And when they ask me, what is my gender? I answer male. You also have to be sensitive in that when you're talking to another person about their gender, about their sex, about their identity, about their sexuality, it is not for us to classify them. It doesn't come from us, okay? All of those identities, all of those classifications come from the other person. And so be aware that you are asking them, how do you define yourself? How do you express yourself? And then however they express it, that is then how I should then respond to them. And you get into the pronouns, and there's a lot. And there are times where my mom says things and I go, Mom, you can't say that stuff anymore. And she's like, well, we used to say stuff like that. And I go, I know, Mom, and you're 75 years old and you can't say stuff like that anymore. So at the same time, now that I'm 50, I have this assumption that the people around me, you included, that if any of my upbringing, my training, and my age ever comes out of my mouth, please be sure and say so. Because we have to be sensitive. All right, so as a male, I carry a Y, okay? And so I express my TDF gene, and therefore I developed as a male. Fine. However, what would have happened if my Y did not function properly? What happened if my TDF gene was silent? Hey, this is what Miss Nunez asked about. What happens if, even though biologically I'm male and I receive the XY, but my Y has a mutation? My Y doesn't express. My Y is suppressed. There's all sorts of chemistry here that can shut down the expression of genes. Something in high school we don't talk about at all. It's coming, okay? So X and Y. So if the Y is silent, then what is expressed? The genes on the X. Well, which hormone gene do you think is carried on the X chromosome?
Estrogen.
Estrogen, right? TDF is over here, but my TDF was silent. Therefore, my estrogen is expressed. Well, if my estrogen is expressed, what happens when that estrogen hits my prenatal gonadal tissue? What would my prenatal gonadal tissue differentiate into?
Ovary.
An ovary. Does this gland in my endocrine system know that I'm XY?
No.
Not at all. Okay. The only thing this gland biochemically responds to is the expression of this hormone, which is an expression of these genes. Okay, so I would then develop into a fertile female. I would develop primary sex characteristics. So in addition to this, I would develop labia, vagina, uterus, ovida, everything. I would be a fully functional and fertile female. Okay, now here's what's interesting. When I would then ovulate, what gametes would I produce? Okay, and the ova could contain what?
Sperm.
Mm-hmm. Which chromosomes? My ovary would
XY.
produce an ovum. Oh my goodness, is that right? Sorry, I'm thinking XY. So of course, what did my brain draw? That's fun. XY was going through my mind, and so of course XY, it's got to be sperm. There we go. So she produces ova, yet her ova could contain an X, or what could her ova contain?
Y.
Y.
And you're like, whoa, man, ova don't contain Y. Almost all the time. We're talking about silent Y. Oh yeah. Ariel just walked through the room like, what you guys talking about? So this is a female, right? A fully fertile female who could produce ova that contain a Y chromosome. Why? Because her Y chromosome didn't function properly, therefore she expressed the hormones that are carried on the X. And you go, hold it. So she's female, but genetically she's male, Her phenotype doesn't match her genotype because she's not expressing all of the genes that she carries. Okay, so what then could happen? Well, if this ovum is fertilized by an X sperm or a Y sperm, easy. If you get XX, that they could form a daughter. If you go XY, they could form a male, a son, right? and they could produce totally viable children, and she would never know she's XY. Okay. Now, with her Y ovum, she could then, that could be fertilized by an X sperm, and they could form a son. Cool. But let's say that it's fertilized by a Y sperm, and you get a YY offspring. This is non-viable. You have to have, there are other genes on the X chromosome that are required for very early embryonic development. And so you can have 1X, you can have 2X, you can even have 3 to 4X's and still have embryonic development. But you have to have at least 1X. If you're missing the X, it's a non-viable pregnancy. So is it possible for this female to be fertile, even to produce offspring successfully, and never know that genetically she's XY?
Yep.
Totally possible. Okay. The only reason why we know this exists is there was a genetics professor, I think at the University of Michigan. I'd have to look that up. And they were teaching karyotypes. And so he had his upper division genetics students do karyotypes, right? And so they go to the lab and they do the swab and then karyotypes, and they develop the karyotypes. And she gets her karyotype back, XY. And she goes, hey, Professor XY. He's like, oh, sorry, it must have been jumbled. Let's do that again. So they do it again. She gets it back and it's XY. And she's like, Prof, huh. So then he sits down with his female student and they do the protocol together, and they get the karyotype back and she's XY, right? So she's like, holy smoke, what's this? And so, hey, X, it's a silent Y. So she then declined to have her identity released, totally her right. She then denied to be studied, again, totally her right. So we know this condition exists. We know that individuals that appear and typical and fertile females could be XY. We have no idea how common this condition is. She could have been 1 in 10 million births. This could be 1 in 10,000 births. We don't know. Okay. We don't think it's much below about 1 in 10,000. Otherwise, stereotypes would pop with the wrong. It's actually correct, with the unexpected genotype. That's a better way to say that. Okay. But the only way to really determine how common this is you would have to have a couple million female volunteers, and you're going to really rattle the cage of a couple of them to find out how common this is. We don't know. Now, whenever we talk about this in class, what I don't want is I don't want the females, right, going to bed at night and staring at the ceiling going, it's me, I'm the XY, I know it, okay? This will have no impact on you at all. You are still going to be a fully developed female. You are still going to be a healthy female. You are still going to be a viable and fertile female, okay? The only thing this may impact is it may impact your fertility a little bit, because you have a 25% chance of your offspring forming as YY. This will never develop a placenta, and so you simply may have a little bit of difficulty getting pregnant. However, if any of you in your future life, there's plenty of time, in your future life have difficulty getting pregnant, do not come back to this and go, oh, that's it, I heard about this, I'm silent Y. There's tons of reasons that could reduce your fertility. But we know that this exists. We just don't know how often it exists.
Mr. Renner, if the spring results in YY, would that result in a miscarriage, or would the female not know at all?
She would not know at all, because the X chromosome is involved in placental development, and so she wouldn't even form a placenta and the beginnings of a pregnancy. And so since she wouldn't form the beginnings of a pregnancy, she wouldn't be able to have the miscarriage.
Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Manuel, I have a question.
I'll bet you do.
So,
you can't just throw this content out and go, next.
So if someone expresses a silent Y, and let's say they start taking testosterone or something, do you think it's possible that the Y won't be silent anymore?
Okay, the Y.
Does that
Okay,
make sense?
yes. Um, the Y will still be silent because something that we don't talk about in high school, there are things called transcription factors. So if you have a gene, and do you know how we talk about RNA polymerase bonding to the gene and then reading the gene and producing messenger RNA? Okay.
Yes.
There are proteins that bond directly to the DNA that can either induce or increase transcription, or they can block transcription. They're called inducers and inhibitors. Okay, those are the biochemical switches that turn genes on and off. Okay, so that could be what's turning the Y off, is if there is a transcription factor that is permanently bonded to the TDF gene and it will never be expressed. So if I am an XY individual and my Y is silent and I start supplementing with testosterone, that will not activate my Y. My Y is already genetically inhibited. It is already genetically silent. What supplementing testosterone will do is entice secondary male sex characteristics. Okay, because if I am old enough to supplement testosterone, that means I am postnatal, which means my sexual reproductive system is already fully formed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. That's why I struggle as a biologist when students ask me questions about being a transsexual and being a transgender, because how I just go for it. Don't worry about it. When people ask about being a transsexual versus a transgender, I always ask them for more details, and I'll be happy to talk about it and explain it. But I want to be sure that I'm answering your question, because as a biologist, a transgender is someone who changes their appearance. As a biologist, okay, when we have Halloween and I dress up as a female and I put on heels, or I wear a wig, or I put on a dress, okay, as a biologist, that's our definition of being a transgender, okay, because I am not changing my sexuality. I'm still male. I am wearing clothes that conflict with the cultural expectations of my maleness and my gender. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Whereas that discussion, there are people that have a very different perspective on transgender. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's different from me because I'm a trained biologist. Okay. So understand that when I talk to you as about being a transsexual, that is if someone decides, all right, I was born XX or I was born XY, and I want to I want to change, I want to alter my sexuality, I can do that. Okay. If I decide to become a transsexual, I can change my secondary sex characteristics. Okay, I can change my physical appearance, but I can't change genetically that I'm XY. Okay, so I could take hormones that I could take estrogen and estradiol and progesterone that would raise the tone of my voice, decrease the thickness of my facial hair, lower my muscle mass, create fat deposits on my thighs, buttocks, hips, and pectorals. However, I would not develop a uterus. I would not develop ovaries. I would not develop a vagina. I cannot change my primary sex characteristics. When you talk about hormonal supplementing, you change your secondary sex characteristics. Again, I am not being critical of this process at all. I'm trying to answer it scientifically. I'm trying to answer it biologically, because it's an important discussion.
Mr. Manor, I have one more question, then I'm gonna leave it alone, I promise.
No, you guys can have, no, this discussion is important. This doesn't make me feel uncomfortable at all. I will answer one question. I'll answer 50 questions. Whatever you want to talk about, it's fine.
Okay, so what if, like, is it possible for later, when they already developed, that the Y can mutate again and not be silent anymore? Like, what would happen?
Wow. Okay. So let's say, so you're saying genetically I'm XY, my Y is silent, So I develop as a healthy, viable, fertile female, and I'm whatever, 15, 20, 25, 30 years old, and the inhibition on my Y chromosome goes away, and now I start producing testosterone.
Yes.
Okay, so that's actually an easy question. This is what some female athletes do. Some female athletes will supplement with testosterone, okay? Because athletically, there are advantages to having a higher muscle mass, having a higher metabolism, having lower fat deposits. Muscle recovery is also sometimes a little bit faster as well. So again, it would not reverse the sexual development of the individual. It will make in high doses, testosterone will shut the ovaries down. Females who are supplementing testosterone will stop menstruating. And if they supplement testosterone over the long period, they can shut their ovaries down and make themselves infertile.
What about before they fully are developed?
What if
Like what, like in the 13 years old, or like when they first start getting their periods?
Okay, at that point, they still have, since they're postnatal, they would still have ovaries and oviducts and uterus, excuse me, not uteri, why did I say that? The uterus. So if you were to supplement testosterone then, they would develop the secondary sex characteristics, but they would be infertile. You would shut their reproductive system down.
Why is there like none?
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, I've tried to do internet searches on this, and it's tricky because there is a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of very judgmental and critical, and in my opinion, toxic information about this discussion. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of effort to find reputable, quality resources. The search history on my web browsers, that they are all over the place, of course, because I'll search up anything, I don't care. But the finding quality information about this is difficult, and so I get a lot of my not the science, but the cultural and social understanding of people who have very, very different views and life experiences than me. And I find them and I go, hey, talk to me. I'm a middle-aged Caucasian heterosexual male. I could not be more middle of the road, right? And I'll just sit down and go, I'd like to talk. I have questions. Help me out here. And 99% of the people are extremely open and extremely friendly, and they're actually much more positive conversations than I've had about politics. Even though we're talking to me about something that's much, much more personal. I find that very interesting. So to me, it's an important discussion to have, and it is something that we need to be comfortable with, especially, I mean, in a science class, if you guys can't sit down and ask questions about sexuality in a science class, you can't be sitting in the middle of your math class and go, hey, could we talk about transgender and transsexuals and silent Y? And I mean, there's just no way. So this is totally the environment. So this is a lot of information to have wash over your brain. So feel free to come back on Friday or the week after that or the week after that and take some questions on this. Cool?
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome.